The plague riot is not a crowd panic at the icon, but the city's response to a death factory disguised as a fight against the epidemic. Why does the fight against the plague begin with people having their property, icons, and freedom of movement taken away? Why are priests, doctors, and ordinary Muscovites simultaneously declared guilty of spreading the infection? Who organized the closed plague houses from which people only left feet first? And most importantly, why were all the real documents about the causes of the riot quietly removed to the archives? 600 meters from the Kremlin stands a building that does not fit into any logic. The largest structure in Moscow of the 18th century. Bigger than palaces, bigger than barracks, bigger than administrative buildings. And all this supposedly for children left without parents, for foundlings, for those whom no one waits for or searches for. A private pier at the confluence of the Moscow River and the Yauza, a closed, guarded area, no visits allowed, complete isolation from the city. If it weren't for the official version about charity, one might think this is a military facility or a secret laboratory. The scale is impressive even today. The perimeter of the building stretches for almost a kilometer. The inner courtyards can accommodate an entire regiment. The basement rooms go deep underground, officially for utility purposes. But why would a children's shelter need underground labyrinths? Why such depth? What was hidden there from prying eyes? The year 1764. Catherine II, having just ascended the throne after the removal of her husband, approves the project of this monumental complex. Her coronation took place very recently, and the master plan of the educational home is already on the table. As if it had been planned in advance. As if someone was in a great hurry to start the work. Construction is proceeding at an incredible pace. For comparison, the Winter Palace in Petersburg was built over 8 years. St. Isaac's Cathedral was constructed over 40 years. But here, a giant complex is rising in just a few years. Where do such resources come from? Where are the working hands? The treasury was depleted after the 7 Years' War, but funds for the orphanage are found immediately. The Pashkov house, according to Bajanov's design, looks like a modest estate compared to this giant. The Senate Palace in the Kremlin is like an intimate mansion, but here is a grand construction for orphans. At the intersection of waterways with its own pier, a strategic point for military facilities, not for a shelter. Security. No visits allowed. No one could enter without permission. No one saw what was happening inside. And there were not tens, thousands annually. Where did so many parentless children in Moscow come from? No epidemics were recorded, no famine, wars were far to the south. Where did this flow of foundlings come from? The documents provide an answer that sends a chill down the spine. In the year 1767, the orphanage took in more than 1,000 children. By the end of the year, 16 survived. 16 out of more than 1,000. This is a documented fact from an official publication released on the centenary of the institution. Almost every child who ended up there did not survive until the end of the year. Infants and older children disappeared with frightening regularity. Statistics over decades show a stable pattern, from 70 to 90% each year. Imagine the scale. In the first 10 years, more than 10,000 children passed through the orphanage. Fewer than 1,000 survived. 9,000 children's lives in a decade. In one building, in the center of Moscow, under the guise of charity. Compare with ordinary shelters of that time in Europe. There, the death rate among children was 20 to 30%. This was considered normal under the conditions of the 18th century. Lack of antibiotics, overcrowding, limited nutrition. But even in the poorest almshouses, the numbers did not approach those of Moscow. In Paris, there was a shelter for foundlings. More than half of the children survived there. In London, the statistics were even better. But in Moscow, in the richest and largest institution of this kind, almost all died. Why? Such statistics are not a shelter. It is a conveyor belt of destruction, a place where children were not saved, but systematically destroyed. Moreover, this was done so openly that 100 years later, tables were published in a Jubilee edition, as if they were proud of the results. What could have been happening behind these closed walls? The official version speaks of poor living conditions, a lack of caregivers, infections, but these explanations do not hold up to logical scrutiny. If the authorities build the largest building in the city specifically for children, allocate huge funds for construction, create infrastructure with a pier and security, can they really not provide the basic conditions for survival? Or survival was not the goal? Maybe the goal was something completely opposite? In the same years when the educational home was being built, maps of Europe still showed designations of vast territories to the east of Muscovy. Lands that had their own borders, their own cities, their own identity. Territories not subject to the Moscow throne. By the end of the 18th century, these designations would disappear. The lands would become part of the empire. But how exactly did this happen? Troops are needed to capture fortresses. But what to do with the population that does not want to obey? How to force those who remember their history, their language, their customs, to submit? A city can be taken by force, but it is impossible to hold the territory if every resident is a potential enemy. A different method is needed. A more subtle one, more effective. A method that leaves no traces of direct violence, but achieves the same goal. And this is where the educational home comes into play, with its thousands of children who did not survive. The term foundling is very convenient. No documents, no history, no relatives. Perfect material for experiments. But what if these were children of the defeated population? Children of territories disappearing from maps in those years. A reform school at the intersection of waterways. Children could be brought there from hundreds of versts away. The Moskva River connects with the Oka. The Oka flows into the Volga. The Volga leads eastward, to those very lands marked as separate territories on old maps. Anything can be delivered by water. And anyone. After suppressing resistance in the eastern lands, children were taken away under the pretext of care. The church blessed it, saying, "We will raise them in the Orthodox faith, provide education." The local authorities did not resist. They had just lost the war. Children were not a priority. They were taken to Moscow, placed in a closed institution, and there they became subjects for experiments. No one asked where so many orphans came from. No one checked whether these children really had no parents. It was enough to call a child a foundling, and he disappeared within the walls of the orphanage, forever. Because in those same years, a smallpox vaccine was being developed within the walls of the orphanage. This is not a secret. It is a documented fact that historians present as an achievement. For many years, the house became a center for vaccine production. Everyone willing was vaccinated there. The drug was manufactured there. The process of creating a vaccine in the 18th century was barbaric. Pus was taken from the pustules of a child sick with smallpox. This pus was used to infect a healthy child through a cut on the skin. If the child survived and the disease was mild, material from their pustules was taken for the next batch of the vaccine. If the child died, it meant the dosage was incorrect and had to be tried again. Imagine the scale of the experiments. To obtain a working vaccine, dozens of dosage options need to be tested. It is necessary to check how long immunity lasts. It is necessary to understand whether infants can be vaccinated, or only older children. Each question represents dozens, hundreds of children's lives. European doctors in the same years experimented with vaccination, but they worked with volunteers, with children from families who gave consent. They recorded every case, published the results, shared their experience. And in the Moscow orphanage, they worked with anonymous material. Thousands of children without documents, without names, without history. Testing is needed to create a vaccine. Test subjects are needed on whom the drug, its dosage, and effectiveness can be checked. Thousands of nameless children, whom no one is looking for. The perfect living laboratory. This is not a failure of medicine. This is the result of controlled infections. Children were deliberately infected with smallpox, observed during the course of the disease, tested drug options. The goal is to gain knowledge that will protect those important to the authorities. And then, in the year 1768, an event occurs that puts everything in its place. Catherine II publicly vaccinates herself and her son Pavel against smallpox. This is presented as an act of an enlightened monarch setting an example for her subjects. But look at the chronology. The vaccine was developed in an orphanage on thousands of children's lives. In the year 1768, the Empress demonstrates that the protection is ready and works. And in that same year, 1768, the Russo-Turkish War begins. Coincidence? The elite receives protection from the disease. The army is assigned a task in the south, war with Turkey, a struggle for access to the Black Sea. All attention is focused on the southern borders. And in the east, quietly and unnoticed, another operation is unfolding. An operation to clear territories that still resist joining the empire. But before the mass use of biological weapons, a rehearsal is needed. A testing ground is needed where all the details of the operation can be worked out. To check how the infection spreads, how the population reacts, how quarantine measures work, how to suppress resistance. And this testing ground becomes Moscow itself. March 25, 1771. A decree is issued to Governor-General Saltykov to move several churches outside the city and bury all the deceased there. No one is to be buried inside the city from now on until further notice. At this time, the mass construction of new cemeteries begins. Bagankova, Dorogomilova, Pyatnitskoye, Myuskoye, Rogoshskoye, Danilovskoye. Work is being done in a hurry. They are hiring diggers, bringing in materials for fences, rushing to consecrate the plots. The authorities demand that the cemeteries be ready as soon as possible. Not in a year, not in 6 months, immediately. The history of Moscow cemeteries begins precisely with this decree. And now the question: why do the authorities order the construction of cemeteries on March 25th if the official epidemic will only begin in the summer? Where did the knowledge in March come from that huge areas for burials would soon be needed? Moreover, the decree already mentions quarantine measures, about the sick who need to be isolated, about monasteries that will be turned into hospitals. All this in March, when there is no epidemic in Moscow. People live ordinary lives. No one is getting sick en masse. But the authorities are already preparing. There is only one answer. The epidemic is planned. Cemeteries are prepared in advance because they know mass deaths will begin soon. This is not a reaction to a natural disaster. This is preparation for a controlled operation. In the summer of the year 1771, a disease really breaks out in Moscow. Officially, it is called plague or pestilential ulcer. Quarantine measures are introduced. Checkpoints appear. People are not let out of their homes. Panic grows. The city freezes. Trade stops. Markets empty. Soldiers patrol the streets. Those who violate the quarantine are grabbed and forcibly sent home. Inspections begin. They go through the yards, examine residents, look for signs of illness. Anyone who develops a rash or fever is considered infected and isolated. Fear grips the population. People do not understand where the disease came from. Why exactly now? Why so suddenly? Yesterday, the city lived an ordinary life, and today there are checkpoints and bans everywhere. And here a detail emerges that exposes the entire operation. The authorities begin searching for the workers of the cloth yard. This is the largest factory in Moscow, where fabric for the army is produced. Hundreds of workers, Dozens of machines, huge warehouse spaces. The official version states, "Through the cloth brought from the Turkish front, an infection entered Moscow." But let's figure it out. The plague is not transmitted through fabric. The plague is transmitted through fleas, through direct contact with the sick, through their secretions. Fabric cannot be a carrier of the plague. The pathogen does not survive on a dry surface. But smallpox can. Smallpox is well preserved on fabric, on clothing, on bedding. The virus remains active for weeks. This is exactly how the Native Americans of America would later be destroyed, with blankets infected with smallpox. The British used this method during wars with the tribes. They gave blankets that had been used by smallpox patients. Within a few weeks, entire villages would perish. A proven biological warfare technology. The cloth yard is the perfect point for starting an epidemic. From there, the fabric spreads throughout Moscow. Clothing, bedding, uniforms for soldiers. One infected roll of cloth can infect hundreds of people. The weaver touches the material, becomes infected. The seller unrolls the roll, becomes infected. The buyer sews clothes, becomes infected. The family puts on new shirts, the whole family becomes infected. And the authorities knew about it, because that is why they were looking for the factory workers, as if they were guilty of spreading the infection. In fact, those who delivered the infected fabric to the factory were guilty. Who controlled this process? Who knew what would happen next? In the midst of the epidemic in Moscow, a strange event occurs. On the Nabata Tower of the Kremlin hung a bell that for centuries summoned the people to the Veche. An ancient tradition, a strike on the Naba meant danger, a call to gather, to make a decision by the whole world. This bell still remembered the times when Moscow was a free city, when important decisions were made in the square by all the people, when the authorities feared the anger of ordinary people. The alarm rang during fires, invasions, uprisings. It was the voice of the city that could not be silenced. And so, by Catherine's order, the tongue is torn out of this bell. Literally. Physically depriving the bell of the ability to sound. The symbol could not be more direct. The power forces Moscow to fall silent. It forbids it to speak with its own voice. It turns the ancient capital into a voiceless, submissive territory. Officially, it is explained that the bell gathered people during the riot. For 3 days in September of the year 1771, an uprising against quarantine measures lasted in Moscow. The crowd smashed checkpoints, stormed the Donskoy Monastery. Archbishop Ambrose, who called for compliance with the restrictions, did not survive the clash with the rioters. But think about it. Why the bell? The outpost can be restored. New church servants can be appointed. But the bell? It is torn out of history, made mute. As if they are afraid it will call the people again. As if they know that the truth about what is happening must not be heard. The uprising lasted very briefly. During these days, Governor General Saltykov fled Moscow. The city's chief military commander left the capital. Who was he running from? From unarmed townspeople? Or from something more serious? 4 lifeguards regiments under the command of Count Grigory Orlov, Catherine's favorite, are urgently leaving St. Petersburg. The elite unit, the personal guard of the Empress, is sent to suppress the rebellion in Moscow. 4 regiments are about 4,000 soldiers and officers, plus a supply train, plus weapons and ammunition, plus field hospitals, plus a cash box for paying salaries. This is a huge military machine that cannot move quickly. And here begins the mathematics that does not add up. The journey from Petersburg to Moscow in the 18th century took 7 days. This is confirmed by Radishev, who made this trip and described it. 7 days for 1 passenger with horses, and 4 guard regiments are thousands of people, a convoy, provisions, weapons. Such an army moves even slower. The roads of the 18th century are dirt ruts that turn into impassable mud after rain. Bridges are dilapidated. Crossings are rare. soldiers march on foot, making stops every few hours. The usual marching speed of infantry at that time was 25 versts per day. The distance from Petersburg to Moscow is 700 versts. A simple calculation gives almost a month of travel. Even with a forced march, a minimum of 2 weeks. If Orlov left after they learned about the uprising in Petersburg, he would not have made it in time. That means Orlov was already in Moscow or near it before the uprising began. That means the troops were prepared and deployed in advance. Because they knew they would be needed soon. Because everything was planned. And then something even stranger happens. After suppressing the epidemic, Orlov and all 4 regiments of the Life Guards returned to Petersburg without quarantine. The decrees demanded strict isolation for everyone who had contact with the infection. Fugitives from the Sukhoni Dvor were caught, whipped, and sent to quarantine. Even a simple suspicion of contact with the sick meant forced isolation. But the elite are above the rules. Thousands of guards who spent 3 days at the epicenter of the epidemic, suppressing a riot among the infected population, calmly returned to the court, without quarantine, without checks. They are welcomed as heroes. Moreover, in Tsarskoye Selo, a triumphal arch is being built with the inscription, "Moscow was saved from disaster by the Orlovs." This is not just a monument. It is an entire architectural structure erected specifically to immortalize the feat. On the park side, there is a more detailed text. When in the year 1771 there was a plague in Moscow and public disorder, General Feldzeugmeister Count Grigory Orlov, at its request, received an order to go there to establish order and obedience, and to provide food and healing to the sick and the poor. Pay attention to the wording, at his request, as if Orlov himself volunteered to go to the epicenter of the plague. What heroism! What self-sacrifice! The Empress's favorite voluntarily goes where the Governor General fled from. A romantic story for the people. But the reality is completely different. The triumphal arch, the solemn meeting, no quarantine. Why? Because Orlov, the entire Life Guards, and Catherine had smallpox vaccinations. They knew that it was not the plague in Moscow, but smallpox. They knew they were protected. They were part of the operation from the very beginning. The arch is built quickly. It is ready by next year. Ekaterina wants everyone to see. Her favorite saved Moscow. He is a hero. He is the winner over the plague. Although there was no plague there was smallpox against which he had a vaccine. A spectacle for the people who had to believe in the power of authority. That is why the epidemic was called the plague, although it was smallpox. There is no vaccine for the plague. There is no protection from the plague. If the disease is called the plague, then the survival of the elite looks like luck or divine providence. But if it is admitted that it was smallpox, then uncomfortable questions immediately arise. Why did the authorities have vaccinations, but the people did not? Why did the elite return without quarantine? How did they know in advance? The Moscow Educational House was the first biological weapons laboratory in history. A vaccine was created here. The elite were protected here. The technology was tested here before mass use. And all of this was done at the cost of thousands of children's lives. Moscow has become a testing ground, a test stand for developing methods of biological warfare. They tested how the infection spreads through fabric, how the population reacts to quarantine, how to suppress resistance by force, how to control information. A torn-out tongue of the alarm bell became a symbol of the ban on truth. The outposts were destroyed. The archbishop did not survive the clash. The governor general fled. But the main thing is the refined technology. Now it can be applied on a continental scale, in territories that must disappear from the maps, on lands marked as Great Tartary. And smallpox really came there. In the same 70s of the 18th century, an epidemic devastated Siberia. Entire peoples were wiped off the face of the earth. Old maps were redrawn. Names were changed. History was rewritten. The Kazakh steppes, where free tribes lived for centuries, have become deserted. Siberian cities, marked on 16th century maps as centers of trade and culture, have disappeared. Ural settlements, where metals were mined and coins were minted, have become deserted. 20 years after the Moscow epidemic, the territories had completely changed. Where cities once stood, new Russian fortresses appeared. Where peoples with their own language and culture lived, settlers from central Russia were settled. Where there was their own statehood, imperial rule was established. The orphanage continued to operate. It continued to accept thousands of children. It continued to produce the vaccine. Mortality remained monstrous for decades. For 154 years, this place functioned as a center for experiments on the defenseless. Over 1.5 centuries, hundreds of thousands of children passed through its walls. Most did not survive. Their names were not preserved. Their graves are unknown. They vanished without a trace, like a whole civilization that disappeared from maps, for the destruction of which they were used. Only in the year 1918 did the Bolsheviks stop this machine. On May 13th, an order was issued by the Commissariat of Social Security, signed by Vinokurov. In view of the fact that the existing orphanages with their custodial trade do not meet the tasks of Social Security for infancy, I instruct to immediately begin the reorganization of orphanages on the principles of genuine protection of infancy. Breeding industry. That is what they called what happened there for 1.5 centuries. Even the Bolsheviks, accused of all sins, were horrified. They saw the documents, saw the numbers, saw the tables where children's lives were reduced to statistics, and they closed this place. Imagine, it took a revolution to stop a machine that ground up children for 154 years. Emperors succeeded one another, wars began and ended, the empire's borders expanded, and the orphanage continued to operate. It continued to take in children. It continued to bury them. History is a chain of causes and effects that are broken so that we do not see the picture. The orphanage, a vaccine for the elite. Cemeteries before the epidemic. The cloth yard. Orlov without quarantine. The torn-out tongue of the alarm bell. Links of one chain. The Moscow testing ground was only the beginning. The development of the technology. And then it was applied on a continental scale. The methodology of biological warfare, created within the walls of the Reform School, proved more effective than armies. Cannons take fortresses, but do not change the population. Smallpox changes everything. It removes those who remember the old, frees lands for new settlers, erases cultural memory. The perfect weapon for redrawing the map of the world. Subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell so you don't miss new investigations. There are still many mysteries and discoveries ahead. We will continue to look for clues, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what official science avoids. Because the truth is always nearby. You just need to want to see it.